Let's start out by creating the entities, the shapes of the data we want to be able to store in some data storage. I'm going to start this out by creating a new folder, add new folder, and I'm just going to call this our models. And I'll start with a new file. I'm going to call trip.cs. So the purpose of this trip class, this trip model, is to store data about an individual trip. So we're going to want some basic information. I'm going to use the prop snippet to quickly implement this. And so I'm probably going to want a trip name, probably a date time for created, so we know when it was created. We're going to want a string for what user created it. We'll get to using this in a later module when we introduce identity. And we're also going to want some sort of identifier. Because I know we're storing this in SQL Server, I'm just going to make the identifier an integer and let Entity Framework generate those IDs for me. And I'll just call this field ID. For each individual trip, we're also going to need a collection of what stops are in that trip. And that's the core of the functionality we're going to be building. It's the ability to have a trip that has a route, has a number of ordered stops that someone's going to make on that trip. So I'm going to build this by using an iCollection of this new stop entity. Let's first bring in the namespace for iCollection, and I'll just call that stops for now. We don't have a stop entity yet, and so I'm going to use refactoring control period to generate a new class in a new file. In the current version of the tooling that I'm using with Visual Studio, though, every time I create a new class using that refactoring, it puts it in the root folder. Not really sure why this is happening. This wasn't the behavior in earlier versions of Visual Studio, but right now it's sort of a bug. I've reported it. But I just have to remember to move these back into the right folder. So I now have stop and trip. And let's go ahead and navigate over to that by hitting F12. When it generated this class, it was smart enough to know the namespace I wanted it to be in was the same namespace as trip. So this is made a little simpler. So let's talk about the things we're going to want for a stop. Like the trip, we're going to need an ID, so let's start there. And we're going to want a string to represent the name of the stop. This is normally going to be the name of the city. Now, once we have the name of the city where this is going to be happening, we're going to use that to generate the longitude and latitude, because we're going to want to be able to map these. So let's go ahead and add those as well as double values. Longitude, let's make sure I don't spell that wrong, and another for latitude. I'm also going to want to have a date time that represents when someone arrives at this stop. First of all, I'm going to need the system namespace, and I'll just call this arrival, or I could call it arrival date. I'm going to leave it at arrival. It's a little prettier. And then finally, these are ordered stops, so I'm going to need an integer that represents the order. And this is something we're going to have to maintain ourselves. There's no way to tell the database to solve the order problem for us. And so now we have the core of what we're really talking about as the data for our application. Of course, this application is really simple in comparison with large enterprise applications, but hopefully it'll give you a sense of where we're starting from. The Entity Framework is going to use these to generate the database. It's going to be using a construct called code first that if you've used the Entity Framework before, you're probably used to. And the idea here is to generate the database based on the requirements of the application's data structures. This is something that the Entity Framework does pretty well. Sometimes you have to hint at it in order to get it to create the database exactly the way you want, but that's the philosophy. In Entity Framework 7, starting from a database and building these models is something that is coming towards the later stages of Entity Framework 7. And depending on when you're viewing this course, this has either been implemented or not. But primarily that will be implemented as some code generation that will look at a database and generate these same entities. Another idea I want you to understand is that there is no base class for these entities. These are simple .NET types. And it's using these simple .NET types to describe what the database will look like. Let's move on and figure out how we're going to store this in a database so we can actually see what's going to happen as far as building that database.